Hello, good afternoon. It's Lindsay from Freedom Media. We're here at the studio. Again, apologise for the slight delay. Trying to sort out a few tech issues. Been getting everything tested this morning. Everything worked fine. Now we've started and we don't quite have... there's been a few hiccups here. So I'm just wanting to say joining myself in the studio is Sophia Moermond, and hopefully I've got that pronunciation correct.
Well done, yes.
So Sophia is a current sitting member in the Legislative Council. That's the upper house here in Western Australia. And Sophia represents the Legalised Cannabis Party here in WA. And I guess, might say controversially, you were stood aside,
yes,
suspended.
Suspended from
Sophia
Parliament.
was suspended from Parliament this year when Premier Mark McGowan implemented the mandates to pretty much everybody across WA. One of two parliamentarians that was in fact suspended due to those particular mandates, declining to provide vaccination status, and that's where I'll say with that. But Sophia, thank you very much for joining us in the studio. You've been on a road trip down seeing your area of representation down the southwest in Albany.
That's right.
And a busy few days, so thank you very much for your time. And joining us, unfortunately, he couldn't come into the studio, but he is still available for commentary, and that is Mr. Paul Filing. So, and thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Lindsay, Sophia.
So, Paul Filing, just by way of introduction, so Paul actually ran, campaigned, and also was successful as an independent member for More. And that's no easy feat for an independent, as you would imagine.
Absolutely.
A federal election as well. We're talking federally here. And then in addition to that, Paul spent 2 terms with the Federal Liberal Party, also for the seat of More. Paul also has extensive experience in the major fraud squad as a detective in that particular squad. So back in the heyday, that was quite a significant force to be dealt with, I guess. They investigated very serious crime. And Paul has also been on the standing committee for the NCS, and hopefully I've got that correct, Paul?
NCA, National Crime Authority.
I will say, so there is a lot to get through. We're here to talk about the pandemic bill, and there is much to get through there. We have a few packages to play, so I'm going to just put that up there, and we're just presenting it in this manner so that those that may be listening and driving in their car can actually hear as we talk through the legislation for the first point. So without, I guess, further ado, I'll just, we'll play the first package. We're going to get stuck straight into this. We're going to tell you what the legislation is as it is in the bill, and then we're going to engage with Sophia and Paul for commentaries. Keep your comments coming through. We ask that you keep the comments within reason, on your position. We know that many out there are feeling quite angry in relation to Premier McGowan. The last thing we want is this stream taken down because there's things that just don't meet those community standards. If that makes sense, I'll leave it at that. So, if we can roll the first package. So we're talking about 77M. This is the power to control entry into a property. So when a COVID declaration is in force, authorised COVID officers, which we are going to talk about, can take control of a place, a vehicle, or other thing inside or outside of the declaration area. So the declaration area can be specified, but they can take control of things inside and outside that. The purpose of this in the same section 3, the officer may enter, if necessary, break and enter into any place or vehicle. And the kicker with this particular section is subsection 5 of that section, and that I'm just waiting for the video to roll up. And as you can see there, an authorised COVID officer may exercise the powers under this section without a warrant, without the consent of the owner or the occupier or the person in charge of the place, the vehicle or the thing. So I guess with that in mind, we'll go back to side by side if we can, thanks. And there we go. I'll start, I guess, with yourself, Paul, if I can bring you into this. Entering a premise, let's not talk about breaking into the premise. Let's just talk about entering into a premise without a warrant. As a serving ex-detective and your understanding of looking at, how do you see that power?
Well, I think that, it has always been the case where if an offence is being committed, or the police, for example, are in hot pursuit of an offender, they may enter premises without a warrant. But other than that, they are obliged to obtain a warrant, which requires them to swear the complaint, in front of a justice of the peace or a magistrate. And of course, that requires them then to give reasons why they need to do it. Now, the reason why that's important is that a person who is a property owner, for example, or a business operator, is entitled to exercise control over their own property without being interfered with, and certainly without having some government official bursting in without notice. Now, the other part of this that's of interest is the fact that it would be an authorised COVID officer, and authorised COVID officers are not very well defined in the legislation as far as I can see, and that means that in effect they can be appointed at any particular time, whereas a police officer needs to be a sworn officer with training and, of course, the commensurate requirements to report, eventually all the way up to the Commissioner of Police, who accepts responsibility for the behaviour of his officers or her officers.
And I guess, Paul, you've mentioned training of the police officers. Currently, you're looking at about 6 months, 28 weeks, a little bit thereover, with police officers being trained. We've seen in the headline just recently that WA Police, due to the attrition rate, which is at exceptionally high levels, that they're putting, even after 6 months training, they're putting police officers out into the community with all sworn powers, having not completed probably one of the most crucial elements, and that is that use of force. And that itself would be a recipe for disaster, I would have thought.
Well, it's interesting as we are discussing this that all of these powers are being given to themselves by the government under so-called emergency requirements. And in nearly all movements towards authoritarianism, usually they are cloaked with the term emergency. And of course, that means that under the guise of emergency provisions, then people's personal and property rights can be withdrawn at a moment's notice by government officials, acting according to a large set of regulations that give them these unlimited powers.
And I guess having heard that, Sophia, let's firstly just give an insight. As a sitting member in relation to this bill, I've done a package that's talking about the debate that's gone on in the lower house.
Yeah.
What information is the government providing for the likes of yourself on this bill?
I haven't received any specific information as yet. So usually what happens when a bill passes the lower house, there tends to be about a 2-week lag before it's read into the upper house, and then we are offered briefings by the government. So I imagine that we're not sitting this week, we are sitting again next week. I suspect that's when those briefings will become available.
So I guess the word that's being used at the moment is that this legislation is being rammed through. We've seen the first, second and third reading in the lower house being pushed through in one day, with the lower house on the opposite being given less than 24 hours. Again, as a sitting member in Parliament, looking at this law that's coming through, and we've talked about without a warrant. Let's now talk about breaking into a house.
Yeah, that is incredibly scary if people are given the power to do that. it becomes a matter of public safety. I can see that if we have someone who's doing some very naughty things in a premise, that the police should have the power to go and do something about that. But if someone is not doing anything that endangers anyone else, should the police or another person or entity have that sort of power? And that's when you start looking at a high level of policing of the public and breaching of our privacy, taking away our freedoms. That is what this is starting to look like. It's very authoritarian.
And I think we fall under the Westminster system of law, and that's something that Paul can also speak to as well. And disregarding gender, because that's an interesting topic, and that's not what we're here to talk about today. So the English maxim that a man's house is his castle, the premise that once you're inside your space, now that could be as an owner, but it can be as a tenant, as a renter, and there's a lot of people within the community it matters not. Your house is your castle, and you have no right to be able to stop where a COVID-19 declaration is being made. An authorised officer, and Paul has mentioned the definition, and we will drill down into that a little bit more about the definition. It's clear that authorised officer encompasses one category, and that's police. So if it's not the police, you have the ability, the Act is suggesting there's an other group of people, and we'll get to that. But yeah, it just goes against all of that, Paul. Would you say that a man's house is his castle, and you simply, in terms of, breaking and entering without a warrant?
Well, the best example of this was in Victoria under similar provisions. The state police in Victoria went inside a couple's home and arrested a pregnant woman and manhandled her as they were taking her into custody, merely for publishing material on the internet, on Facebook, I believe, that voiced her opinion about the mandate powers. Now, under the provisions in Victoria, which, as I say, are similar, there was this use of the powers to, in effect, stifle any opposition or discussion about the use of such draconian legislation. And these are absolutely contrary to the spirit in which most Australians view the free exercise of their own premises, their own property, whether they are an owner or whether they are a tenant with a tenancy agreement. You cannot just enter without a warrant under normal circumstances. And these powers seek to do something that are way, way beyond what most people, if they really considered this deeply, would consider to be acceptable. And we're moving towards almost a gradual, stealthy, step-by-step authoritarianism. The worst example was Sophia being prevented from representing her constituents in the parliament because she was not vaccinated, as far as I'm aware, or certainly would not discuss her vaccination status. And that means then that where a person has elected a member like Sophia and wants them to represent their point of view, they can be prevented from going into the parliament and voting, which in my view is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. I was actually present because there was a protest at Parliament on the day, and at the time I can remember seeing Sophia heading towards the Legislative Council as she walked through Harvest Terrace. And at the time she was obviously going straight into a situation where she was going to be prevented from representing her constituents. Now this is a prevention of the rights of the people who elected her. And irrespective of the method of voting, irrespective of what one might think of preferential voting. The point is that she is an elected member of the Legislative Council and was entitled to exercise her right to represent her constituents and vote in legislation.
And I see, Sophia, that's striking a chord with you.
Well, yes, because I was prevented from representing my constituents in a democratic country. So that was undemocratic right from the beginning. And I know many people have opinions about preferential voting and that, I understand that. I would just like to reiterate that we did not hire a gentleman named Glenn Drury to buy our preferences. So, and quite a few people actually did also vote for us directly. It was very stressful that day, by the way, for me personally, to go in there. I did not know what exactly was going to happen. So it was on TV that I actually swiped and managed to get in, which I wasn't sure about if my swipe card would work that day. And then participating in the discussion that was based almost entirely around the fact that the Honourable Nick Goran and myself had chosen not to breach medical privacy.
And just for clarification, we're talking about February this year.
Yes,
I mean, we're not talking
February
about, we're not talking, a year or 18, 16 months ago. We're talking about February this year, at the height of when Premier McGowan mandated pretty much most of West Australia.
Yeah, exactly.
So that, some may have seen the press footage, others not, but there was a considerable amount of press talking about Sophia's suspension from Parliament. So, and again, coming back, that's one example of not being able to represent your constituents as an elected member. If we're coming back, we're talking about the power of entry again. So we're talking, and as I've briefly touched on as well, you have an occupier. So the scenario where you have a person who's leasing a premise and the police come in and force their entry into that premise. So a lease agreement would have you as the business owner potentially liable for damages there. There's one thing in the bill, it's silent in relation to who pays for damage if police happen to cause in, who knows. There's plenty of businesses where they get in before working hours, early hours of the morning, a scenario where they're not open for business, but they just hear a noise at the door and boom, there's forced entry. So there's all of these issues as well, insurance implication issues, for the righting of wrongs or causing of the law of tort for damage, talking about that.
Well, I've always understood that the function of the police was to protect us as people, not to enforce very specific laws. Okay, and I feel that, and it must be very difficult for some police officers, especially to be in that role where they're now being used to enforce things that they might not agree with. So, it's and the police force is not there simply something to be used by a government to enforce certain policies. Keeping us safe should be their primary directive. So I find it very strange that they have moved away from that very easily, by the way.
Yep. So they've lost the function, community service, protect and serve for the community. And now, essentially, I'll put it in this context, the police have been weaponised to carry out.
That's a much more succinct way of saying it. Thank you.
That's that's in many ways to look at it, and that's one. Paul, can I just ask again? So those instances, entering a premise, either the person in charge, the controller, again, damage is caused. Or can be caused if entries force in. There could also be injury to a person who simply may be there And again, I'll use the scenario. Let's take a cafe. I think we spoke about this the other day, Paul. And they're just simply there. And all of a sudden they find themselves in the middle of this. The impact of how the optics of that looks for a business, surely that hasn't been taken into consideration in this regard.
Well, I don't think that the people that have drafted this legislation gave that any consideration whatsoever. I mean, ultimately, as Sophia's talked about, I mean, the police are there to protect the community. They are seen as being non-partial. They're seen as being there to enforce the law and to prosecute people who've committed an offence. And this means that effectively the police has become a political weapon used by a government. And the irony of this is that years ago, when I was a young police officer, the then Court government introduced, I'm talking Charles Court, not Richard, Charles Court introduced legislation to amend the Police Act. He brought in Section 54B of the Police Act, which were essentially designed to prevent secondary boycotting by trade unions. Now, the Labor Party and its supporters campaigned vigorously against this. And ironically, they're using pretty much exactly the same powers, or being given the same powers here. But more importantly, these powers are not just going to police officers who are sworn officers and responsible to the law. It's also going to be towards authorised officers, who could be anybody that they authorise. And that means essentially that a person or people could be authorised to do and use these powers on behalf of the state government. Now, the difficulty with these types of powers is that once they're created, they could be used by anybody. And I'm talking now that, you know, they may lose power and the other side may get into office. And then, of course, you have the situation where they may choose to exercise the powers themselves. And the other side, meaning the former Labor government people and their supporters, may well be, end up on the receiving end. It's important that we make sure this stops. And unfortunately, Premier McGowan, with his huge majority in the Legislative Assembly and, of course, with his majority in the Legislative Council, is in almost an unstoppable position to do anything about it, for us to do anything about it. And it's not helped, of course, by the fact that the opposition have been so feeble and ran such a feeble campaign at the last state election to try and stop him from getting re-elected. This means then that there's no sense of, a true balance in our democratic parliamentary system, the Westminster system, which requires there to be an effective opposition so that people can hear in their parliaments and on reports criticism, valid and rational criticism of the legislation and changes being made by a government like the McGowan government.
And I just want to acknowledge that thank you for those that are sending the comments through. We are, at some point, we will take some Q&A. I just want to pick up one comment here that's come through. And firstly, I want to say this. I've put out 3 packages now in relation to this bill, that one a couple of days ago, and the number of shares of that particular package, the number of comments, the comments coming back in and so forth, there is a very, very serious level of concern over this particular bill, and it matters not what your politics is. So it's caused a lot of concern. That those that may have heard 6PR this morning. I have one of the team here in the studio who was talking about or brought to my attention comments said on 6PR today. And I guess that's as close as we can get to acknowledgement by mainstream media. With Liam Bartlett, he is, for whatever reason, he's no longer going to be there. I think he's stepping down in November. But there was 3 panelists on 6PR who were talking about that this is the most serious piece of legislation, and there was a hint that there is serious concern within the judicial circus in Perth, and probably perhaps rightly so. The comment I want to make just here is that with the name of Bunny. So we'll assume that that's the correct name. But with such draconian laws, would this qualify West Australians for refugee status in other countries where they can live in a safer condition? I mean,
Wow.
I guess there's no point crying, so the best you can do is laugh about it. And it's, a plan B that, if this comes in with no review, government review at all, it is some cause for concern. So I think in terms of entry, what we might do now is we'll just play the next passage. There's about 4 key areas that we want to have a look at, and we'll just bring that to you now. So this is talking about the powers of in relation to persons exposed. So again, when a declaration is in effect, a COVID officer he may direct a person who has been exposed or a class of person who may have been exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus to do any of the following. So, and if you're talking about that who may be exposed, and a scenario I can think of is that you're at a large shopping centre, there's a particular outbreak at the shopping centre, you may not have COVID, but they could reasonably draw the conclusion that you may have been exposed because you were at the shopping centre. Therefore, you would fall in, I would suggest, as that particular class. But this is the kicker. This is probably the one there. To submit to infection prevention and control procedures within a reasonable period and in such manner as specified by that officer. So, we're now talking about what is submit to infection prevention and control procedures. In the explanatory memorandum supporting the bill, it says, for example, that a mask is a prevention and control measure. Is this crossing the line that an officer can direct you to take a medical procedure contrary to your wish?
It certainly looks like that. There's also no clear description of what a reasonable period of time is and what a reasonable manner is. You see, and reasonable can be interpreted in so many different ways. You need to have that clarified, because this allows anyone to almost do anything they want as long as they can say, I thought it was reasonable. I think this is dangerous.
That, if I can just bring side by side up as well, thanks. Yeah, that was probably one of the tech issues there. Paul Funning.
Yes.
Your view.
Well, the problem is with requirements to undertake, health-related procedures at the direction of an authorised person, means that those procedures, whatever they're requiring, can be changed, and they may include, for instance, forcible vaccination. And this is the area that I'm most concerned about, because one of the challenges of our most recent outbreak of COVID is the fact that it appears that no matter how many times you've been vaccinated, it doesn't stop you getting it. And so consequently, the prevailing wisdom, and I use wisdom in inverted commas, exercised by the government and its public health authorities, may well not actually be in the best interest of its citizens. And so therefore, having so-called authorised COVID officers running around exercising powers under these provisions means that people that could be well subjected to health and other safety requirements that they're not particularly wanting to do. For example, they may not want to be vaccinated for very good reasons. And one of the things I discovered about this whole scenario about vaccination and the mandates is that even if you are entitled not to get vaccinated, in a sense that nobody can stop you from not being vaccinated, then they use provisions to make it extremely difficult for you to be able to go about your business without being restricted in a variety of ways. So therefore, a form of intimidation, which is another way of enhancing an authoritarian state. And it's interesting in this core that the opposition to these mandated powers that state and other governments have taken upon themselves has come from the conservative section of the political spectrum and the left. People are concerned on both ends of the spectrum because they can see this being one more step closer and closer towards what is in effect a authoritarian form of government. And the worst example of that is New Zealand, where I think the best article I've seen written about the COVID emergency powers taken by governments was by Brendan O'Neill, republished in The Australian, which talked about the New Zealand government, the Jacinda Ardern government, as essentially an iron fist in a velvet glove. And it is now starting to attract humongous opposition within the country. People are getting hardly sick of it. And I think that this is also going to happen to Mark McGowan and his supporters in Western Australia, because eventually people are going to get sick of being told what to do by officious public officials and bureaucrats who seem to feel they know better than the citizen that they're ordering around.
And I think you've mentioned, Paul, there that those in New Zealand are now getting to the point that they're sick of this. And Sophia, I've mentioned on previous streams as well that the pandemic management bill in Victoria saw at its peak over 600,000 people marching on the street in protest to this bill. So did the bill still come in? Yes, it did. It saw, I wouldn't say wholesale changes, but it saw significant changes in order for that bill to get through. Are there some measures that are draconian? Yes. Some of the fines to businesses and an individual, $50,000, is huge. That's a lot of money. But in listening to the debates in Parliament, in the lower house leading up to this bill, there's many references that's mentioned from the front benches of McGowan's cabinet, talking about we're doing what's being done on the East Coast. We're doing what's done in Victoria, we're doing what's done in Melbourne, and so forth. But it's clear that there's nothing like this in there. There is no other state in Australia that has an amendment to a COVID response in a piece of law or proposed piece of law that gives people the right to enter.
Power.
Yeah,
Such
without
power.
So I just want to make that point clear, in relation to that. Unfortunately, due to some tech issues on the rest of the packages, I can't roll those out, but I'm going to read them to you. And I'm just going to cover, we've spoken about authorised officers, and it talks in section 77B, where it talks about, there's two things in that, and it defines, that's the closest definition that you have to an authorised officer, and that is the State Emergency Coordinator, which by now most people may know, perhaps, and should know, that person is a non-elected bureaucrat, and that is the Police Commissioner. He fulfills the role currently as the State Emergency Coordinator. The only other definition that you can find in relation to authorised person is a person who's been authorised under section 77I, which is part of the proposal of the bill. So you now need to go down to 77I to have a look at that, and I apologise, the package is not working, but I'm going to just talk you through that again for those that are perhaps listening whilst driving, which is a good way to bring yourself up to speed, I may say. And it then goes on to say that the State Emergency Coordinator may authorise a particular class of persons to enforce this particular act, should it become act. And of course the catch-all is there must be a COVID declaration put in place, a COVID-19 declaration. So when it talks about that, it's so a particular class of persons. Again, it's written in a manner that is very hard to determine what does that actually mean. So it goes on, section 77I goes on to say that once you've been appointed, that could be done on the fly. It can be done orally. You can get from the State Emergency Coordinator, he can say, you're now an authorised COVID officer.
Right.
That's the first point. Let's just hold it there. And
Where are the medical qualifications? Right. This is really a really important component that is missing from that. You know, our Premier isn't a medical specialist in any field. Our Health Minister isn't a medical specialist. The Police Commissioner is not qualified in medicine either. Where is that component? You cannot deal with any sort of disease, communicable diseases in an epidemic or a pandemic if you don't have a good understanding of medicine, virology, all of those things. And that's not there. It's not represented in this bill.
And there would also perhaps go further, Paul, if I say a man who's been exposed to serious fraud and crime and things like that, you're talking about, you know, fiscal obligations as well. Where's the consideration for that? Where's the consideration? You've spoken, Sophia, about actual physical health. There's mental health. There's family, religious circumstances, and many things where you're talking about a person being deputised on the run. And if that declaration, or if that deputation, I should say, is made to a person, there is a requirement in the bill that they must be provided with that authorisation within 7 days. However, that a failure, this is section 3, 77I of the bill, that a failure to put the authorisation in writing after 7 days does not invalidate the authorisation of anything being done by that person who's been given that authority.
Okay. So that seems like a lovely way to cover oneself.
Well, there's no accountability. I guess, Paul, you were about to say, what's your thoughts on that?
What you could do is create an auxiliary police force composed of people who don't even have a written authority from the State Emergency Coordinator. So, as you quite rightly pointed out, it's straight out of a cowboy film where you just pick people off the street, make them deputies, and give them guns and tell them to go out looking for
on the fly.
offenders.
Yes.
Now, the basis of our criminal justice system is that we have a police force that acts responsibly, that is acting within the law, and is composed of people who are sworn officers, meaning that they have taken an oath to protect the law and to fulfill their obligations in protecting citizens and property. Now, in this particular case, you could pick any old person. Now, I go back to the Victorian example where police officers entered a home and manhandled a pregnant woman for merely publishing material on the internet, on social media. Now, this means something that is far more frightening. It means that you can have anybody appointed orally on the spot, and they could kick open the door of somebody's house, drag them out and apprehend them, and in effect, even if the matter was illegal, it can be authorised post-event by the emergency coordinator. So in other words, this means that even in the case where something that is done by a authorised COVID officer turns out to be illegal, it can be post-dated as being now legalised. Now, I don't know about other people, but in my case, I'd be horrified. I mean, the wonderful thing about our police and criminal justice system is that allegations, in particular prosecutions and charges, can be tested in the court. And in serious cases, they can be tested in front of a judge and jury. And that means that there is a testing of the decisions made by the police officers and the decision in particular to prosecute by the police and Crown prosecutors. In other words, they can't exercise those powers without restraint. Here they can, because all they need is a verbal authorisation. I don't know if I've seen anything like it before.
And I guess what one of the issues with testing the powers in a court is that it's after the event, and the benefit of hindsight, whilst it may come into play, but if you've had a person that here we're talking about the authorised person. So firstly, there's also their safety concerns, the level of training that they particularly have. And then they execute a provision of this particular power, and then they direct the person to undergo a control or prevention measure that is then looked at and bisected to the nth degree 9 months down the track. But how do you make right somebody who, for example, may have a well-documented medically sound reason for not undergoing this medical procedure? We're talking about getting the COVID vaccination.
Yeah.
And
well, here's a case, Lindsay. Right. We've seen the story about the Rockingham Hospital, where a person who wasn't deceased was put in a body bag.
This is just recently, yes?
Just recently.
Yes.
Who was not deceased and was sealed up in a body bag. He later died. But the point was that the people at the hospital then asked the doctor attending to the circumstances of death to post-date it, to put it back to the time when he was put in the body bag, when of course he refused, because he's, as an independent doctor, he refused, and he's since left the hospital. So credit to him for having the moral stance of taking a stand against this type of behaviour. Now you imagine the situation where you were in the receiving end of a procedure like that. And the authorised officers under the COVID procedures are merely given an okay later by the emergency coordinator.
So and I'm just getting some direction from the production team there. I apologise. Keep the hands off the desk for me. I tend to do that. So again, we're talking, and that is an example, Paul, that you raised, which is of concern, and looking at things after the event. I just want to stay with authorised person. The closest that I can find that may outline or offer some insight as to what particular class or classes of person an authorised officer may extend to. And you need to go down to section 77W of the Act, where it talks about modification of state and local arrangements. Something, again, which was raised in the debate for this bill in the lower house, that there was no consultation with WALGA, that's all your local government. There was no consultation with the legal community in relation to this. Now, in there, it talks about saying that there's a number of parts that are in a normal act. That's standard. There's nothing new here. The main catches of what we're talking about are covered in Part 2. In this one here, where it talks about modification of the state and local arrangements, it says that whilst this part is in operation, so let's just say, here's the scenario. There is a COVID declaration declared. Part 2 then comes into play. An authorised officer has all these effects. The state emergency coordinator can then say, it says that the suspension of the state emergency plans, the state emergency policies, state emergency arrangements for district managements, local emergency management arrangements, and so forth, that the state emergency coordinator can override those. But just stay with me for one bit here. So then it goes on to talk about the SEMC, which is the State Emergency Coordinator or Management Coordinator, a District Emergency Coordinator, hands off the table, a District Management Committee, a Local Emergency Coordinator, a Local Emergency and Management Coordinator, or a local government, as the case may require, may carry out functions under Part 2 or 3 in relation to the policies, management and arrangements accordingly. So here's my take on this, and I'll put it out to you both to say, so let's just look at one level, local government or local emergency management. That could be your SES. Volunteers, Part 2's enacted, which means it's not saying only this part of Part 2, it's saying all of Part 2. So Part 2 can be, is that an authorised person? A volunteer for SES, can they be given these powers where there's a COVID declaration by that section there?
It certainly looks like that's the case, and that is once again, very scary. These are very, when you look at what some people can do here, the power that they have, do they have the background, the understanding, the decision making, process, education, all of those things, that they can enact that in a fair manner? You need educated people. You need trained people. I'm not disputing any of that. But yeah, a local SES volunteer does not have that medical knowledge necessarily, or the knowledge of the various laws either. So I just find it incredibly scary legislation, to be honest. Just keep on going back to that.
Yeah. And,
We're
again,
on-
I'm not saying that you can go and look at the act yourself. If you follow down and drill down and chase things, and this is what I've spent the last week and a half doing, it's clear under this act, the way that it's written, and I'll read it out again, that when a COVID declaration is in operation, okay, that a state emergency coordinator, a district emergency coordinator, a district emergency management committee, a local emergency coordinator, a local emergency committee, a local government, a ranger, a shire ranger, a council ranger, no disrespect, a person who has training, but not trained in the use of force, not trained to executing one of the most absolute powers a person can have, and that's deprivation of one's liberty, and then compromising body autonomy, may carry out functions of Part 2 and 3 in relation to those policies, plans and arrangements accordingly. Could be open to interpretation. I don't know. That's the best I can find in relation to what may encompass a particular class or classes of person as an authorised officer. What would you say, Paul? How would you interpret that?
Well, let's look and see exactly what has happened in the more recent past to get a little bit of guidance. During the COVID lockdowns, you may recollect that there were quarantine hotels, and security in those hotels was in effect contracted to private agencies. And in many instances, we learnt of how lax and ineffective those particular personnel were. And of course, there were instances, for example, where outbreaks occurred because of the interaction between the security guards and people who were under quarantine. And then then COVID spread into the wider community as a consequence. So the problem with this authorisation process is that you can go along almost like playing tag and just touch somebody and say you're an authorised officer. It could be anybody. It could be somebody from the State Emergency Service. It could be a fire brigades officer. It could be a police officer. It could be a private security officer. It could be somebody passing you in the street, so long as they've been given verbal authority, and they may not have any training or any idea exactly what they should be doing. Now, clearly, that is taking it to an extreme, but what it is showing is that the legislation does not appear to be well written, and it certainly, for a private citizen, should be considerably alarming, because it means your next door neighbour could be appointed and given the powers to be able to enter your premises.
And okay, so we've covered the power to enter without a warrant. We've covered authorising person, or an authorised person that can act particular powers, the right of entry. I want to move on to the next area that I want to dive into, and that is section 77K, and that talks about identifying particulars. That's police speak, what they use for your name, address, date of birth. So there's nothing to see here that that's a current provision that's in place with a number of pieces of legislation. Although there are some precursors, reasonable suspicion of having committed an offence or witnessed an offence. What we're talking about here is section 77K. Again, when a COVID declaration is in effect, that a COVID officer for the purposes of the criminal investigation identifying People's Act 2002, may ask a person personal identifying particulars. So under that act, that section 16.4, I think it is, the police can ask you your name, address and date of birth. Again, nothing really much to see there. Not until you go down into section 2, that then starts to talk about that a COVID officer may, where they're reasonably, well, for the purposes of COVID management, in a broad brush in saying COVID management. So what is that particular, reasonably required for the purposes of COVID management? So they don't want you in this area, or they want you to move from this area to that area. Is that reasonable? You would say yes. So then it gives them the power under this section here that they may force a person, request is the word they use, but it's requesting a person to give the officer, and this is where it goes further than name, address, date of birth, because it says any or all of the personal details. Now, under the definitions of the Act, and that's where you would go to try and find out what is personal details. Is that your personal mobile number, for example?
Yes, but I imagine they're after specifically your medical information, which essentially is not their business, because we all have a right to medical privacy.
So, Paul Filing, I guess in agreement with Sophia's comment, medical information?
Well, of course. And the most important part of this is that now, under normal legislation, the police have the power to request the name and address of a person who is in a public place, if there are reasonable grounds to suspect an offence has been committed or that it's likely to be committed. Now, that has always been, as far as I'm aware, the case. So, but this particular one will give an authorised officer, which again we've talked about, could be anybody, to go into a person, break into a person's premises and demand that information from them. There appears to be no restriction going into a person's premises. Now, a police officer can't do that. If they knock on the door and say, "Who are you?" you can refuse to tell them. Now, unless you're committing an offence there and then, or there is, fear that life is in danger, then the police may not enter without a warrant. Now, in this case, they can, and they can come in. Not only can they come in without a warrant, break their way into there, I'm not talking about police authorised officers here, they can also demand particulars from you that a normal police officer under normal circumstances can't. So in other words, they've extended the powers of, in effect, surveillance powers considerably, and they can use this for all sorts of things. As again, back to the Victorian example, publishing material on social media can constitute an offence, meaning that they can come and break into your house and drag you away without a warrant for something that is only an offence because somebody somewhere determines it to be an offence. So at any particular time, an offence can be created or specified by the emergency coordinator, and so any person can be made verbally into an authorised break in, arrest you, and drag you out.
So I guess the Demtel ads, but wait, there's more. Unfortunately, there is more, and it's not a set of steak knives. So in addition to, as you've mentioned, medical information, so the powers extend to compelling your breaching, doctor-patient relationship. It can extend to doctor-lawyer relationship. It could extend to doctor-priest, doctor, whatever religion denomination that you have, the confidential information, that you potentially may have. But here's the more. And it just, it's unbelievable where this goes. And not only do you have to, once it's been requested, to provide that information, that the officer can ask the same question of not only you, and that's fine, you accept that, but any other person who the officer believes may be able to provide them that information. So there's your breach of patient
confidentiality. It's
just
right
gone right there.
Yeah.
And legal privilege.
That follows on from the current, what's happened now is the politicalisation of the doctor-patient relationship, where doctors have been coerced or encouraged to not necessarily give vaccination exemptions to people. So that has already started that process. And once again, I think that's scary, because it's not a doctor's job to perform the duties of a government or police people or anything like that. Their job is focused on healing people, making sure that people have the best treatments available for them on an individual level. So I've mentioned this before, that when you look at treatments, no one treatment suits everyone. And currently that choice has been taken away from people and doctors. So, and it looks like this is going to go even further with that, which is, I'd be concerned. And
if a set of steak knives, Sophia, is not enough, I'm going to now offer you the steak knives and the pots and pans as well. And that is that your answers to those questions, that it matters not that if you move on, and I'm reading section 4 here of section 77Q of the Act, where it talks about that a person is not excused from complying with the direction from an authorised officer on the grounds that the information that you may give is or may incriminate you.
Right. So you have to speak the truth. And if you speak the truth, you may get more in trouble too. Wonderful. That's going to stimulate honesty.
And it clearly states here that, if it exposes a person, it does go on, and before I bring you in on this, Paul Farling, I will say section 5 does say that the information and the answers given by the person is not admissible in relation to an execution of that, unless it's under an offence of section 89. Now, section 89 of the Act is not under this bill, it's not under review. That's in the emergency management plan as it stands now. To give you a brief of that, section 89 just talks about if that you can't provide misleading or false information. Paul, the old expression, the policing expression, going on a fishing trip.
Well, that's right. Ultimately, when you're investigating something that is actually a serious criminal offence, the things that restrict you are likely to be, for example, people asserting their rights to that information by virtue of their relationship with their doctor or their lawyer, or the solicitor, sorry. So these sorts of privilege, medical and legal privilege, protect people from having to have information relating to their medical and legal circumstances shared with others, which has always been an important principle, and places lawyers and doctors in the invidious position that they may be required to participate in giving that information. This is all part and parcel of this strong authoritarian flavour of the legislation. It appears benign to the extent that it looks as though it's only relating to more dangerous and, I suppose, alarming aspects of a pandemic, but it can be used in so many insidious ways. And I hate to go on about the example in Victoria, but that is the one that alarmed me the most. The fact that somebody can be dragged out of their house, arrested, merely for publishing an opinion on social media. I mean, this is much, much more frightening, for example, than many of the other provisions. The fact that you can be prosecuted for holding an opinion that is contrary to that of the authorities. Now, that is the most authoritarian form and draconian form of government you can have, and it certainly extends far beyond our parliamentary system of governance. The fact that McGowan enjoys such a humongous majority means that he can cower and intimidate his own members of parliament in the Labor Party to ensure that he can just roll through all these types of pieces of legislation until the next election gives the community a chance to vote. Bearing in mind, of course, that he's already amended the voting system for the Legislative Council that has in fact deprived many people in regional Western Australia of having a voice that is of any significance in the determining of government and legislation and the way in which, for instance, their own lives may be conducted in their regions. And this is all part and parcel of a longer plan by the Labor Party to, in effect, deprive other parties, other groupings within the community of having their political voice. And Sophia's party, which sets out to achieve objectives that many people in the community actually support. I certainly support the use of medicinal cannabis, particularly in the cases where people are affected by such awful afflictions as epilepsy and the like, to the extent that they are entitled to have their views represented in a way that allows them to be expressed and acted upon in the state parliament. What McGowan and his government are trying to do is, in effect, deprive people of that. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see there being amendments to the voting system in the Legislative Assembly as well. And we might well see amendments that would change the preferential system and would deprive people the opportunity of having a member of parliament like Sophia, which, no matter what anybody says, she's a voice, an alternative voice that expresses points of view that people want to hear and they want to have represented.
And elected in a democratic process. Sophia, yeah, and you've heard what Paul Filing is saying, I guess, the fear amongst not so much the front benches but the back benches. I'll put the question out there and I'll take it as a rhetorical question, if you like, or you can take it as a rhetorical question. Mm-hmm. What's the mood like walking the halls of WA Parliament?
What's the mood like? It depends on what bills are being debated, and how much you don't agree with the government, I guess. Those are the two big influences. Overall, when I'm in there, I'm there with my colleagues. All right, so we're not necessarily nasty to each other outside of the chamber, if that makes sense. We'll stand next to each other and have a cup of tea in the tea room. So it can be friendly in there, but I find that when we have some of the more difficult or controversial bills going through, that some of that friendliness wanes for a while. But it's not nasty as such. It's just.
Well, thank you for
we're all there. We're all trying to work together.
Yes, and I guess we know the classic the DCM, the Don't Come Monday. Now, if you had a Labor Party backbencher, and perhaps I'll bring Paul in first on this and see without putting yourself on the spot. If a Labor Party backbencher was to go against. Let's call it as it is. Mark McGowan, exactly. Thank you. Go against the Premier right now in relation to this bill. If he was to go against that, would that result in a DCM? Don't Come Monday.
As far as I know, with the Labor Party, they are not allowed to vote against the Premier, and if they do, they get suspended. So, that's hearsay. I've heard that from other people. I have not seen it in action, and I am not privy to the exact rules that the Labor government works under.
Well, Paul Filing, a person with your experience in federal politics and also state?
Well, ultimately, the authority is exercised by caucus, Labor's caucus, which of course is a meeting of all of the members. But by and large, the caucus elects the leader and it elects the ministers, or elects the people who should be ministers. And the person who flouts the decisions of the cabinet and votes against them for the Labor Party is likely to be either suspended or, at the least, they'll lose their pre-selection at the next election, meaning that their career would come to an end. So, of course, that means that there are many, particularly new members, who would consider that to be the last thing they want to do, and so they sit mum and keep voting blindly. But in fairness, some of them probably believe that Mark McGowan got them elected in the first place, so they ought to support him. But I'm always of the view that, the best examples of leaders doing well and then coming a cropper later is John Howard, who not only was the second longest serving Prime Minister of Australia, but also was the second only Prime Minister to lose their seat at an election. So it's an interesting phenomenon that eventually all political careers end in failure. And Mark McGowan's day will come when he'll go down, and those people that have supported him will probably run for cover and try to avoid blame for it. But I suspect that many will be accused of having sat on their hands and dumbly supported legislation that is, in my view, completely contrary to the Labor Party's platform. I mean, the Labor Party is not designed to be an authoritarian party. It's designed to represent workers, and in particular to give the trade union movement a political voice. This is the sort of authoritarianism you'd see in countries where dictatorships have arisen, and changing the voting system, changing how you elect people, it's another sign of trying to ensure that you don't lose power, even if you lose popularity.
And I think, if you're talking about, I guess, it would be fair to say that, people think when they're electing for a person that person is going to, and that's what do your recent trip down to Albany, what are the people telling you, Sophia? Are they coming up? What's the mood there?
What's the mood? People are concerned about the emergency legislation, okay? But at the same time, for a lot of people, COVID doesn't really exist anymore. That it's gone. They're not really busy with it anymore. They're not wearing masks. We're all hand sanitizing away still, but no masks, no social distancing. Most people have moved on. The rest of the world has mostly moved on as well.
Can I ask you this then? So we've got the Labor Party versus the Legalised Cannabis Party. Nonetheless, it's both all elected under the same democratic process. The expectation that you represent those that gave your vote or their vote to you, to represent you in the manner in which you said that you would. When we have here voting against the caucus, the Labor's caucus, and what you're talking about in the attempts of legalising cannabis for whatever reason, we've heard Paul Filing say that, for medicinal purposes. And I might say here that those that may not know, Sophia, you do have a clinical nursing background, as well as you have
naturopathy and traditional Chinese medicine. So when you look at cannabis, it's a herb, it's an amazing herb, it does many things medicinally for people, and we should have a right to use it. There are other herbs out there which are legal at the moment, which might be considered more dangerous. There's groups of herbs that are known to have caused liver damage in people. There are actually, with cannabis, there's very little side effects. It's very safe to recommend, and none of the side effects so far have included death ever or liver failure. Some people can be allergic, but you can be allergic to anything. So that's a different group of people. Once again, it is very safe, and I believe that part of our bodily autonomy, that we should be able to decide what medicines we take, and if we want to grow our own herbs in our garden or our own fruits and vegetables, that's our choice. And we should be allowed to do that. And nobody else should be able to tell you that you must undergo a particular medical treatment.
And I guess as an elected member of the Legislative Council, your party, would you face uproar from those that gave their confidence of their vote if you then turned around and said, you know what, we are now going to promote the use of diazepam?
Okay.
I mean, you're moving away
purposes.
from your core value of
Absolutely.
what you...
Yes. Yeah, so that is a fine line that I have to walk at times. We are a single issue party. Our focus needs to be, because that's why we were elected, on the legalisation of cannabis. So I have had people be angry with me for not disclosing my medical status and then being suspended from government, because that meant that I was not representing their point of view. Whilst I do understand that to some degree, what happened to me was undemocratic, I feel, and nobody should have lost their job because of this. So I feel that they're, being angry with me when you really should be angry with the people who made that happen, not so much me.
And I guess it's fair to say then, based on that, a single issue party, nonetheless, you're holding true to what you campaigned on in terms of that.
Bodily autonomy. You want to use cannabis, you want to use it medicinally or recreationally, that is your choice.
Yeah.
And that you should be allowed to make that choice. And that bodily autonomy that goes through to abortions, reproductive health care for women, and then you're looking at vaccinations and other medical treatments around that as well. Your body, your choice.
And I guess I am just going to explain again, those that may have just joined the stream, or just to bring you up to speed, Sophia was suspended from Parliament February this year. There was 2 parliamentarians. The second parliamentarian was Nick Gurian, who is the Liberal Party Attorney General, Attorney General, opposing that, where Nick Gurian came out and said, he disclosed his status of vaccination, and again, that's his choice. But he said, and we're talking about if the Liberal were in power, he would be the highest lawman in the state. His position was that there was no legal basis in which he could be requested that information and be obligated to provide it. Yeah. Is that a fair recollection?
Yes, I'd say so. And Nick Gurian is incredibly thorough in his understanding of the law.
Well, and you'd expect that of a person who is in opposition to, we only just have to look at the recent track record of John Quigley, and a man, and again, let's play the game. Let's play the ball, not the man. So Quigley and McGowan versus Clive Palmer. It has gone on that John Quigley, in an unprecedented move of somebody of his stature, somebody who understands his law, made an application to redact the evidence that he gave in the defamation case. That's the first point. And the second point was that, to redact evidence that you're sworn in and you understand the implications, it's using perhaps a legal provision. I would suggest you've either perjured yourself or you're trying to set the record straight. Let's go with he's trying to set the record straight and he has made an error or he recollects other facts. It then goes to the state that he tried to redact that evidence and he wanted to submit it on affidavit evidence, which then prevents, as Paul Filing has spoken about earlier, that evidence being tested in a court of law. Because there's no giving evidence in chief, which means there's no re-examination or cross-examination. Those processes just simply don't apply. So we have, on one hand, the current Attorney General. Where has John Quigley been on this matter? And I will say, for the record, that I did email a number of Labor Party members, including John Quigley, asking for some comment to come in and offer some commentary supporting this bill. And I can tell you, as of going to air today, there has been no response from any of those, including Sue Ellery, who sits in the upper house, have made contact there from Freedom Media WA. And now I'm not going to say decline or refused. I'm just simply going to say that they have failed to respond to the invitation to come and let's talk about this, because there's a lot of people that want to get an understanding of how this is how this is going. I do want to just come back. I'm just seeing a couple of comments that are going through here. And I think we've sort of covered the 4 points. If I can, Paul, if I can grab, say, another 10, 15 minutes, are you okay with a few questions from the stream?
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Yep, and Sophia,
Sure.
if I may. So there's a comment just coming in, and I think it was Jane. I apologise, Jane, if it wasn't. I am going to try and pick that up again. There is a few comments coming through. Jane's question was, do you have the authority to ask the authorisation or authorised officer for their powers, for the fact that they have been declared? So I can tell you, Jane, when I saw that question come through, I am trying to find the particular section, and I can tell you that yes, you do have the ability to ask for that power. I guess the difficulty is the power can be given by verbal direction. So,
How do you prove it?
How do you prove it? It's a he said, she said. At the time, had that come through, well, that's issue number one. And issue number two is, even if that authorisation had been given in writing, which out of the two you would accept is the higher standard, that even if that writing, the Act says it must be provided to the authorisation or authorised officer once they have been given the power within 7 days. Once they give that direction to a person, they must have that written direction in writing within 7 days. But the out in the legislation in this bill says that if it's not provided within 7 days or not provided at all, it doesn't withstand the authority and the direction that has been given. So it is there. I am going to try, I'll just bring Sophia comment on that, and I'm just going to try and see if I can find exactly the section that it says.
My comment is
There
that
was 77
what that
M.
means is that anyone can claim to be an authorised person for 7 days at least.
And Paul Foley, your thoughts on that?
Well, look, 77M, which is the section that is proposing to provide that authority, merely gives what it says: an authorised officer COVID-19 officer may exercise powers under this section without a warrant or the consent of the owner, occupier, or person apparently in charge of the place, vehicle, and or thing, or other thing, which means essentially they can act whether they provide evidence of their authorisation or not. The following section and the qualifying section later merely provide requirements to substantiate these things if necessary at some stage later within 7 days. So in other words, you could do it on the fly and then go back and try and cover over it by giving a consent several days later for something that occurred before, rather like the doctor who was asked to backdate the death of the poor unfortunate guy who was alive when placed into a body bag in Rockingham Hospital.
Yeah. Yep. Which amounts to a cover-up.
So there's your living example, and I hate to use that term, but the living example of the sort of thing people try to do in order to cover off where they've made serious errors, like it appears to be the case at the Rockingham Hospital. Now, this is coincidental because it's in the medical area. And here we've got an instance where someone who needed care and attention treated as though they were dead because people were working under great pressure and stress. And then in order to justify it, they were trying to get the poor unfortunate doctor to sign the death certificate and backdate it. I mean, if that's occurring today, under the circumstances we're in today, imagine what it'd be like in an emergency COVID-19 scenario.
Yeah. It's only going to get more stressful, and then, more pressures on people. And we're looking at that right now. Our nursing staff in particular is, and all medical staff at the moment is under so much pressure. They're understaffed. There's ambulance ramping. There's people needing to go into quarantine and things like that, so they can't come to work. There's so many factors that are influencing their stress levels right now, and I can't see how this is going to make it any better.
It's not. No, you're right. You're right, Sophia. And as a person with your background, professional background, you'd know only too well that nurses and particularly medical staff try to do their best, but even with the best of intentions, mistakes can happen. And mistakes can happen particularly when you're short-staffed, under-resourced, and of course in a situation where you've got a higher than usual demand on your attention and work.
So if you have those that are watching the live stream, if you have a question for Sophia or Paul, then please jump on to the stream now. Put your question out. We'll pick this up. I'm just going to duck behind the scenes just to have a look and show how to do that. We might even try, if we can, if you do have a question, maybe let's just go with the question here first. I just want to leave you with this whilst it gives time for people to punch their question out. They're saying that let's hope that there's 5 brave Labor Party members that will cross the floor for this bill next Tuesday. The likelihood of that occurring?
0. Unfortunately. Yeah.
Paul Farling?
I would think.
Zero again?
Yeah, I would say that it's almost completely unlikely. Many of these members would not want to lose their seat or their pre-selection, I should say, and to cross Mark McGowan would be a fatal step in the Labor Party at the moment. He's in such a powerful position.
So I guess that's no speculation. So I see a comment coming through from Jacqueline and Sophia with a nursing background, that she has a friend, and like many people that I know from the coverage I've done at rallies and things of that nature, and as I've said, competent and capable, experienced people willing to offer their skill set. In Jacqueline's case, her friend, 35 years as a nurse experience, yet with the state of emergency ending, we still have mandates for healthcare.
Yes, we do. Yeah, and I'm aware of quite a few nurses who have chosen to not return to work at the moment, and we're talking mostly about women with many decades worth of experience whose insight and knowledge will be incredibly beneficial for whatever patients they're dealing with. I'm so sad because if you've been a nurse for a long period of time, you're very dedicated to people, you want the best for people, and to stay in a nursing profession for that amount of time means that is your calling. That's what you really want to do in life, because there are so many influences out there that can take you away from nursing, because it can be hard, the shift work, the lack of resources, changing policies, all sorts of things around that. It's not the easiest job to have. So it's absolutely bizarre that we are not allowing those people to come back in the workforce right now.
And I've often said on coverage on this matter, that nursing is, sure, we all get paid and it helps make ends meet. But for nursing, it really is. And all of those associated with, right through from those that sterilise equipment, make sure that the rooms are sterilised and cleaned, from one extreme to the other in the healthcare profession, that with the amount of experience that you're talking about, it's passion before pay. It really comes.
Yeah. And good pay is deserved, by the way, by all of those nurses and doctors and other associated roles. But yeah, you have to like people. If you dedicate your life to people like that, you have to. And patients deserve that too. They deserve staff who want to. They deserve care that shows insight and that experience. Yeah.
One thing I want to just circle back to, and that is, you may have seen on the back here some of the graphics coming through. So pop a comment in there if you understand what the yellow and black is as well there. That let's see the Quentin Tarantino fans out there. But it's a step down and it's a modest approach. This is exactly the slide that I'm talking about. This is a comment that Mark McGowan has said, not on the day of the debate of the bill, because he didn't even attend Parliament, which I've covered on the stream, but the day before. That's what he said. In addition to this bill, the powers, which is mentioned in this bill, of the state emergency that have been put in play to date, can be enacted and run parallel with this bill. There was a lot of commentary by Reece Whitby talking about the success of the Labor government, McGowan and his government, managing COVID. Great success in a number of many areas. That success was attributed to the powers contained within the state of emergency. To have two, is that a step down? Is that a modest approach?
Not in my opinion. No, not at all modest. In particular, the fact that anyone can become an authorised person, as Paul Filing rightly pointed out, referring back to the security guard situation that we had for keeping people in quarantine and how that didn't always go as planned. Yeah, if you really want to, this is a medical problem. It's not really a government problem. It's a medical problem, and we're not having any medical people speaking up about this, and those who are brave enough to speak up about it are silenced as well. So you're only allowed that one narrative. This is not a step in a direction of controlling people.
And I guess when they've enjoyed the success that they say, and there has been some successes, I won't deny that. For some people, there's no suggestion that COVID's not real. It's just that it shouldn't be managed with draconian powers like this. But if you have a mechanism that has given you that success and you're making public comment about that, then why not stay with that mechanism? That's, I guess, they can implement the state of emergency. Why do you need to have the provisions for two? I don't know. What we've seen, and if we come back to authorised officers, we've seen very early in the stage. Even Dan Andrews, which is, he's been likened to Mark McGowan on many occasions. They still talked about something as simple as mask exemptions, and that if you have an exemption, that you don't need to comply with the mask. Mark McGowan never did that. He never advertised on any of the government websites that if you have asthma, for example, those autism, so mental health conditions, things like those, a number of grounds, you had to dive through get to the bottom of the Bicky barrel to find out that provision was there, but it wasn't put forward by the government. There was only one option. And then when things escalated, it kicked up to the ability to police it became an issue, and there was pushback. This was around your suspension time.
Yeah.
And then Mark McGowan pushed the onus back on shopkeepers, on 16, 17, 18, no disrespect, but those that, are just entering the workforce or studying.
These young people, they need safeguarding. They shouldn't have to be used to police unfair laws. And they were.
Yeah. So now you have a shopkeeper. It doesn't matter. Let's just go with a shopkeeper who now has been empowered to say, back in March, April, May this year, you have to show me your letter from the doctor. That's number one. But now this Act says that if I've been deemed an authorised officer, which can be retrospectively enacted by saying, well, you just had an oral, as Paul Filings used his doctor signing off and backdating the time of death on his Rockingham scenario, that in a particular scenario there, that it could be targeted and used for people for not good purposes, by saying that person had the right to ask you that, and the fact that you didn't, it's now an offence.
Yeah.
So that, I guess where we're going, just trying to pick up on, I'd love to read out your comment, Kelly, but we don't have an active beep for that. So I guess... just trying to pick up on Greg's and just saying, okay, well, what if a West Australian is charged with this particular bill, or what legal avenue do they have in terms of defence? I guess, Carla, neither of us are here really qualified to give legal advice, and even if we could, we know what's happened with the doctors, and you've mentioned, Sophia, with APRA, and those that don't by now, those that may not be aware of this channel, more and more people are coming on. APRA released $5,000 fine for doctors who went against the COVID narrative, and then it went on that if they went after the first offence, they would face deregistration. So, we haven't heard from the legal fraternity during this COVID pandemic at all.
I received my APRA renewal notice yesterday, an email, and I have emailed them back that they are not a political organisation, and because of how they handle things over COVID, I won't be renewing my membership with them. So, what APRA did is absolutely unforgivable in how they decided how, as a registration body, they had the right to tell doctors how to treat patients. That's atrocious. That wasn't their job. There's nobody.
Sorry, Paul Filing, do you any comments in relation to that?
Look, I mean, the main thing about the COVID / medical health system is that people who were working in the medical health system were put under extraordinary pressure, have suffered extraordinarily under the provisions of the various decisions made by the state governments. And I mean, I sometimes wonder exactly how it is that they manage to tolerate it, because a trip to a public hospital at the moment is a very eye-opening experience. You see exactly the sort of conditions that both staff and patients are enduring. And, this is a state government that is enjoying a record surplus and could have spent large sums of money upgrading hospitals, providing more beds and the like. And yet we face the scenario where you have people in, say, public hospitals like Joondalup who are lined up in the corridor waiting for attention for hours. And that's just unacceptable. And you can understand how stressful and distressing it is for the nursing and medical staff.
Absolutely. And I can say, I certainly, whilst we've been trying to get the studio up and running, I've received many stories of as you've just mentioned, Paul Filing, the state of the hospital and how the treatment of people coming in. I can think of a case, and I was going to do a story on there. In this case, it had a particular outcome. I can understand them not wanting to go public, but I know that this family, they would be happy for me to talk about this. They, in a regional area, a child who has a medical condition but is also autistic, have come down not 2 months ago to receive some treatment, and the mother of the child, who was 12, was not admitted to the hospital to be with her child, going in to have a general anaesthetic, nor could the mother be there to comfort her child coming out of the anaesthetic. And it was simply a case of come to the front door and hand your child over to staff clad in
PPE. Yeah.
And as a child who has autism, and I won't go into what degree or whatever. I mean, that can be a particular lasting infraction on their memory for many, many years to come.
There could be a whole lot of trauma there, and having, I mean, there are many stories of family not being allowed to say goodbye or to support their family members simply because of their vaccination status. It's inhumane, to keep loved ones away from sick people. It really is. And in about, I think, September last year, I spoke about how medical apartheid could be a result of all these things that have been introduced, and how once you start with a system of othering people, all right, so you've got the anti-vaxxers and the vaccine enthusiasts. So an anti-vaxxer is a derogatory term, right? So you start with othering of people, and then once you've othered those people, you enter a process of dehumanization, and that dehumanization leads to behaviors of enforcement and control by the local government, and we are seeing that right now, but also by people who feel emboldened by that and who then follow the rules of that government. And it's easy for them to do that because the group that they're talking about has been dehumanized already. And once you enter that phase, you need to bring in stronger regulations to control that group that's at the bottom of the heap. And that is what this looks like. This legislation looks like it is designed to make sure that that group of people that we all don't like are managed. And then the only logical step after that is violence. Every single time, anywhere in the world where we've had a process of othering and dehumanization, you look at the group trying to control that lower group is using violence, possibly forceful vaccinations, whatever that is, and then that group that is oppressed starts to fight back after a while too. And that is where we're going. And I'm really scared that that's what's going to happen. I hope that people who are listening to this or involved will speak up against that, because that is what we're doing right now has been shown to happen all throughout history. This isn't something new or random. Okay, this is a very specific pattern, and we need to stop it.
Most lessons are in history.
Yeah.
But we just need to go back through history. I will just say that for Paul Filing, thank you for your time. We did start due to a few tech issues, so that was my issue, and we've gone over the time that I indicated for you. Paul, I know that you have another appointment that you need to go. I thank you very much for your comment and input here. I guess
Thank you.
we might just say, I do want to ask the question about remedy, and I understand, Paul, you have to go 5 more minutes. Sophie, can I? I've got one question that I've come in. Paul, a parting comment in relation to
Well,
your time, did you think that you would see a bill of this nature?
no, the irony of all this is I can remember the reverse when people who would have been supporters of Mark McGowan are in the street protesting against the coalition government of the day, introducing wider powers, effectively move-on powers to the state police under Section 54B of the Police Act. Compared to this, the Section 54B was almost of no great consequence whatsoever. These are draconian, insidious, and authoritarian powers conferred on themselves by a government that is run by an effective tyrant who needs to be voted out of office. That is the only remedy. We have a constitution and we have the means to do this, and we need to keep reminding Western Australians exactly what they have let themselves in for. Because you might agree with some of the provisions one day, but the next day when they're being applied to you, you might find them as not as pleasant as you thought. And so I call on Western Australians to be vigilant, to oppose these measures, and to make sure that they tell their members of parliament, Labor, Liberal or otherwise. And I have to say the coalition has been absolutely asleep at the wheel with this. They were at the last state election and they have been ever since. They honestly have sat back and allowed Labor to roll all over them. And unfortunately, we're now left with this scenario. And it's unfortunate, but we need to keep working away to resist it.
So, thank you very much, Paul Filing, for your comments and joining the stream here. I have seen a number of comments. Those may have jumped on the end asking who Paul is. I will just recap. So that's Mr. Paul Filing, who ran in the federal seat of Moore as an independent, campaigned for that, successfully won that seat, and then went on to serve 2 terms with the Liberal Party for the same seat. Before moving up. Well, currently, Mr. Paul Filing was number 1 on the federal ticket for One Nation in the federal election just gone. As state coordinator for Pauline Hanson One Nation, and what has been of particular interest to me in bringing Paul into this stream is his background as a detective of the major fraud squad. Back in the day, that was certainly quite a highly effective unit investigating very serious crime, and Paul has sat as the standing member on the National Securities Commission. So that thank you, Paul. I understand that you have to go there, and that's the time delays for myself. I am going to try and bring. We spoke about remedy. Paul's spoken about that, and so the question now is remedy. I do have a question I might just throw to you, Sophia, just while I duck behind the scenes and see. The questions come through asking about Medicare and what we've seen, that Medicare is compulsory, and we've seen a number of people who have been refused treatment. Yeah. And where does that stand? And it could extend not only to Medicare with the mandates. We've had those that are members of sporting clubs and they've paid annual fees and so on and so forth, that all that the decision has, financial members, the mandates have come in and, no compensation reimbursement.
They were just banned because they chose not to choose their medical information. Yeah.
So that I will...
I hope they feel brave and sue.
So a comment that did come through, and here's a question. They're just saying, okay, so if an authorised officer used the powers to come into your home, and they gave you, because it is contained within here, we haven't drilled into that, but it's widely assumed that they can come into your home, they can make you submit to a procedure, they can direct you to leave the declaration area, yeah, and go to an undisclosed location for as long as they wish, which you've commented on yourself, Sophia. Yeah. That if they were to come in between that 7 days when they come back with writing, that's the time to pack the bags and go. Now, I would say that you'd be breaching what was the direction previously. This potentially will now be law, and not good advice. I would have thought not a good plan B.
No.
Can I ask this then? So you're going to sit next Tuesday.
Yes.
And you're going to hear this bill come up. The last step before it goes for.
That's right. It'll be read in.
What message can you tell people about the sense of anticipation? I don't want to say fear, but that in this. I mean, how do you tell somebody that it'll be okay?
How do you tell someone it's going to be okay when the Labor Party has such a majority? They can push through currently any legislation that they want. They don't need the opposition. They don't need the crossbench. They've got all the power. So if you're going to ask me to say it's going to be okay, I can't give that guarantee. We need to work together to ensure that people understand what this sort of bill could mean for our personal freedoms. Now, I know many of you have been campaigning and raising awareness for the last 2 years, and we now have a very clear divide in Australia, and WA in particular as well, between those who are pro Mark McGowan and whatever he wishes to do versus those who don't agree with that. It's a hard state to overcome. The only thing in the end is that Mr. McGowan's leadership will end at some stage, and we may find that we'll need to reverse certain bills that have been introduced under him.
So that, I guess it's a lot of onus to put on, from your viewpoint, how do you tell? I'm sure people, exactly that, what do you say? I see the comments come through and I just think, I really don't know what to say in relation to this. Do I understand it completely? No. Do I understand it enough to know that there's some serious concern here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really, so we're going to just try something here. Just bear with us for a couple of moments. We're going to see if we can bring in, we're talking about the issue of remedy, and see if we can bring somebody in on the stream who has emailed in and wants to talk about remedy. Just while we try and get that person in, I'll just see if I can pick up on a couple more comments there. There's many things. So I want to talk about financial relief if this declaration is enforced and a person needs to go from their home or being told to leave their home. So now, there are people that will have rent, there are people that have mortgages and so on and so forth. A renter that defaults in this rental market can be quite dire at the moment. Although it may take some time to get them out, but nonetheless, a rent default, a mortgage owner defaults on their home loan because they simply can't work. Now they can't even live in their place that is their castle. And we're talking about the compensation. Now, the Act talks about compensation. It is a little bit silent, but it does go on. I'm still trying to get an understanding, but Sophia, it seems as though there may be a compensation package if you're told to leave the area or leave your home. But the precursor for qualifying for that is if you qualify under the conditions as though you were making a first homeowner's grant.
Right.
So that's precursor number one. Precursor number two is it's at the final discretion of the Treasurer. Not shall or should, may consider if financial compensation is appropriate and may then implement that. So I guess The Treasurer
has a lot of power there too. I might be slightly cynical when talking about the government and their ability to hand out money to ordinary people. There are often so many qualifying points involved in that it just didn't work for that person, and that tends to then be, it doesn't work for a lot of people. So a lot of people tend to not qualify. And then you can say, but we've got a process of compensation, right, which you do have, but often that process is so complex, so difficult, or has so many qualifying features to it that people give up before they get to the end.
And while Sophia's been speaking there, I am just trying to find that particular section. And of course, you know, for those, I mean, surely people by now would know that the Premier Mark McGowan also holds the portfolio of Treasury. So I guess that, you know, the decision comes down to him. You know, again, which I might add that it was no secret, I guess, of Premier McGowan appointing himself as the treasurer. What I guess was a secret was that he has those that form part of his cabinet that have way more experience in a treasury role than Premier McGowan. And, you know, we know, certainly in this state, we've seen WA Inc., where we know Labor government who appoint themselves. We've just seen recently with Prime Minister Scott Morrison that by secret. Now, I'm not suggesting that Premier McGowan's done this. I'm simply saying that he's been across a couple of key pivotal portfolios, controlling the purse states. And, you know, even right now, the Premier McGowan's at loggerheads with the nursing profession, seeking a pay rise.
Yeah.
And, you know, for a job that you said, you know, yes, passion before pay, but they certainly deserve.
Everybody deserves appropriate remuneration for what they do. And if that, you know, with nurses and doctors, they have to keep up with their registrations, which cost money. They have to usually make sure that you get enough CPE points for a year. So I'm not quite sure what that is for nurses here or doctors, but I know as an acupuncturist and naturopath, I need 20 CPE per year. All of these professions require for people to be dedicated, and there seems to currently be so many factors there that a lot of these people are becoming disenfranchised and unmotivated and are looking at different employment opportunities, which I understand. It's a very tough place to be. All that stress, irregular hours, and then possibly working against common sense when you look at viral or bacterial diseases. So anyway, Lindsay has left me here by myself at the moment, and I'm not quite sure what to talk about further. I'm sure he'll be back very, very soon. I do appreciate all of you tuning in, because I understand that we need to stick together on many of these things, and that I am in a privileged position, in a government position or a parliamentary position that not many people have. And I realise that then asking you to keep on talking about it, to keep on speaking up, and to keep on fighting against this, I understand that for people that can be a very difficult thing to keep on doing. So I appreciate what you are doing.
And just trying to bring that person in that's talking about remedy behind the scenes. Greg, I should say, I'd just like to clarify that unlike what Scott Morrison did, Premier McGowan didn't bring himself under secrecy. It was fully disclosed. He followed the process. There was nothing untoward in terms of the process. You know, my suggestion is simply that he has a person, and that person is Rita.
Sophia?
Safiot, who has experience with Federal Treasury role, not as the Federal Treasurer, but in the Federal Treasury. She has a tremendous amount of experience. McGowan appointed himself as Treasurer over her, and the comments, as I recall it, he was saying that he wanted to allow her to concentrate on the MetroNet because she had been heavily involved with that, and he wanted to see her bring that project in. Now, he appointed himself Treasurer 6 weeks into winning the last election back in 2017, and we've seen MetroNet. We're still waiting. I mean, a massive blowout in terms of cost blowouts. I mean, that's a whole different stream in itself.
Yep.
And it looks like maybe we're not quite able to bring that person in. That's Yep, I'm not sure. Okay, so I can say that in terms of remedy, there's a number of questions coming through. Thank you very, very much in relation to that. So I will say this, that the person has come through and, and I think it's fair to sort of put that out in terms of remedy. I don't know what the solution is. There's no silver bullet in relation to this.
Yeah.
You have mentioned, Sophia, the strength in people coming together on the matter like this. This person wanted to speak to, and I'll just say that his name was Julian. And Julian wanted to say that he is part of the WA Freedom Alliance here in Western Australia, and that they have actioned called or put an action out, what they're calling a Kill the Bill protest action next Tuesday at Parliament, 12:30, and that will be on the doorsteps of Parliament House. I guess I've covered a number of rallies at Parliament House. The one that stands to mind for me was December 11th when the construction worker mandates kicked in. I know at the particular... I can see they're trying to bring them in, and whether it's actually working or not, but whether I've stolen his thunder or not, he did want to put the call out in relation to that. But it doesn't look like it is going to work. So on that, so there is comments here saying that people have seen it on Telegram, talking about that, those that are in Telegram groups. Perhaps what I might do is I'll grab the link and put that up, talking about that. Can I ask you this? So you've been in Parliament when there's been people outside talking about this. Can you hear the people outside?
Sometimes, yes, absolutely. It also depends where you are in Parliament House. Okay, so it's not, if we are in our parliamentary offices, I'm on the freeway side, and we can hear quite a lot in there. Yeah.
So the freeway side, and I guess and your observations of any of those movements, certainly vocal, but peaceful in the main.
Absolutely. Yep. Peaceful. And we get emails from the security services letting us know when protesters are going to be there or are expected to be there. And for those days, we get extra security, so more police officers around the premises as well. I have not ever felt scared or threatened by any of the protesters there. So I think that's good. I think that's a beautiful WA thing that we need to keep, really, ideally. We were also, we've had discussions about that as part of our training in Parliament, or our induction, that when you are dealing with people, you need to make sure that you are always safe as an MP, but also understanding that when people are out there and they're very angry and screaming, they lose credibility. All right, so you need to be calm, engage with the MPs there. But if you are just going to be angry and swear and whatever, you are not going to be heard at all. So so try to be relatively nice, direct, not threatening, because that's how you get engagement.
And I think not only for this particular action, but just in life in general, that's always a good way to go forward.
Yes.
So I think we've certainly well and truly covered the issues that we wanted to cover through. Thank you for all of the comments there. I can see we've just ticked the 2-hour mark. Doesn't time fly? Thank you very much for those coming in. Plenty of comments saying thank you for your time, Sophia. You've just done, as I said at the start of the stream, a trip down in Albany.
Yes.
I just want to tell us about Albany.
Tell us about Albany.
Yeah. How did you find that trip? Talking to businesses and...
Yeah, look, the Southwest is beautiful. Okay, and we are incredibly privileged to be living in this country. You know, we've got relatively clean water and clean environment, and we're driving around Albany. There's the beautiful ocean. There's all the islands. It's amazing. Overall, there, people are very friendly. I mean, as a politician, I'm not that famous, not like some of the Labor people. So everybody's generally very nice to me, which is great.
But I mean, as a politician, though, you're there to represent the people.
Absolutely.
Surely,
we're talking about things like restrictions, the state of emergency, and how that's been affecting business in the Southwest. A lot of businesses do not have enough employees, and they're not able to actually find more employees. So they're advertising, but businesses have not been helped by the COVID restrictions overall. So we're starting to see more businesses closing down, and
this is in Albany. You've
in
noticed this
Albany,
as well?
or simply not having the staff to open at different times. So that is a major problem. I don't see how this legislation is going to fix some of the issues that they're dealing with, because really what we're looking at, the ideal situation there is to go back to pre-COVID regulations, and then you get more of your backpackers back who can do hospitality jobs, or local people for that matter. But it is definitely a backpacker society where you're looking at hospitality, but also fruit picking and sheep shearing, a whole range of things. So that seems, we haven't got that level of tourism, I guess, where we have a lot of the backpackers coming through. An interesting side effect of COVID was, and the relative freedoms that we had in this state, was that people couldn't go to Bali. All right, and now what we found with this latest school holiday, people are going out of the country and now spending less of their tourism dollars locally. So that's fascinating.
It's a snowball effect. It's having a massive impact for those in not just in Albany, but all regional towns
That's
like
right.
Albany.
They're dealing with all of the same sort of patterns.
And this bill doesn't provide the certainty in terms of planning that and I should say also that I do want to hear a little bit more about Albany, but there is a sunset clause with this, that the legislation is into effect for 2 years from the date that it's actually proclaimed. And so let's just say that if that was to come into effect at, say, in 2 weeks' time, essentially the state election for WA is March the 8th, I think it is, roughly around there. So that's 4.5 months, roughly, before the state election. But at any time in the next 2 years, these powers could be implemented or and
extended once again.
So how can businesses plan?
How can business plan? That is a really good question. And to be honest, I don't have an answer, because what they're being given is a whole bunch of insecurities. They're not being given really clear guidelines. I mean, if we... I'm sorry, I'm not very articulate right now. I am usually, okay. We have moments like that.
I've pushed the time. We've gone over, and I've certainly
run out.
got my pound of flesh in terms of questions. Thank you, Sophia.
Yeah. I don't know how business can prepare.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
So I think, as I said, we've certainly ticked over a couple of hours, and there's a couple of things in the beginning of here. Thank you for those that have jumped on. Thank you for those that have given the comments. Certainly appreciate that. And for your time, I did send out a number of invitations, and it was, by surprise, I guess, that you responded. We had a couple of discussions more around timings than anything else, but everything that you've said and your views and so forth, nothing's been pre-planned. Please stay on stage. So thank you for the candidness of that, for your time, Sophia Moermond, and again, it's origins, Dutch origins.
It's a Dutch origin.
Yeah. Can you speak Dutch?
I can speak Dutch. Ja, ik spreek nog Nederlands.
Lekker me through. That's all I know. But, that's about it. But there we go. So from myself and Paul Filing, who was here with the stream earlier, who had to go off to a meeting, which is fine, and member of the Legislative Council, currently sitting here in Perth, Western Australia, Sophia Moermond. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for all the interest from the people out there.